It's now time to look at Macintosh and Windows. Docker is exploiting containers, which is a built-in feature of the Linux kernel. So until very recently, containers have been something very specific to Linux. Now that has changed a little bit. In September 2016, Microsoft released a new version of Windows Server 2016, and that's the first version of Windows that have implemented their own implementation of containers that run natively on Windows. So that's great and exciting, but at the time of recording this, so I'm in 2017 when recording, this is for containers on the server edition of Windows. This doesn't really change things when you're developing locally. So if you're running on Windows, then you almost certainly do not have native container support on your development computer. And as far as I know, if you're on a Macintosh, then you definitely don't have any kind of support for containers on your operating system. As I said in the previous chapter, that doesn't mean you can't develop on Docker. You can, it's just that we have to do a little trick to make it work. I'm not going to talk any more on this course about native Windows containers. It's something of a new feature and this is going to develop over time. But in any case, really, this is only of relevance if you're planning on deploying your software to a Windows server. Now, I would say that's a fairly unusual thing to do for Java development, so I'm not going to think any further about this. However, of course, it is common to develop on Windows or Macintosh, so what are you going to do? If we follow the link for Get Docker, and I'm recording on Windows, but actually the details that are about to follow are very similar on Macintosh. And by the time you watch this video, they may have changed the structure of the website, but of course this is going to be a straightforward download. First of all, there are two editions of Docker. It's the common pattern in open source software in that they produce a community edition and an enterprise edition. And naturally, the community edition is free, whereas the enterprise edition is commercial. The community edition will more than suffice for what we're doing on the training course and actually would probably be sufficient for many professional developments as well. I invite you to check out the enterprise edition if you're interested in any of the features in that edition. So you should be on the download page for the community edition. And then complexity is, depending on which version of Windows or Mac OS you're running on, there are two very different installations that you need. Well, this is a little bit complicated, so I will switch to a caption. If you are running Windows, then there are two possibilities. If you're on Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise, or later, you're going to be downloading Docker for Windows. Otherwise, you're going to be downloading Docker Toolbox. So the otherwise here would be Windows Vista, Windows 7, or Windows 10 Home Edition. I'll talk in a moment about what Docker Toolbox is. It's a similar story if you're on a Mac. If you're on Yosemite 10.10.3 or above, then you will be getting Docker for Mac. Otherwise, again, you're going to be getting Docker Toolbox, and this will be the Macintosh version of Docker Toolbox. Now, what's this all about and what's the difference? Well, let's start by talking about what Docker Toolbox is. So you'll be getting this if you're on the older versions of the operating systems. What this will do is it will, in the background, install a copy of Oracle VirtualBox, which is a commercial virtual machine system. And all this is going to do is it runs a Linux kernel in a virtual machine. So it is a bit of a trick, really, that although you are developing on Windows or Mac, we are going to be using a virtual machine just to get those container features from Linux. Now, if you're worried about this, I can assure you that it's all in the background. You don't actually have to run Oracle VirtualBox yourself. It will all be largely in the background. Only if you get advanced do you actually need to do anything with Oracle VirtualBox. So it's a bit of a trick really, but if you're on those newer operating systems, so just to remind you, that's Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise, or I guess any future operating system from Windows, or for Mac, Yosemite 10.10.3 or above, then you will get Docker for Windows and Mac. And the big difference here is that it's still running a Linux virtual machine. I think some people think that the Docker for Windows or Mac is some kind of native support for Docker. Actually, it isn't. It is still running a virtual machine. It's just that it's using the native virtualization support from your host operating system. So it doesn't need to run Oracle VirtualBox is the fundamental difference. So on Windows 10 Professional, that service is called Hyper-V. I must admit, I'm not sure what it's called on the macOS. I haven't developed on macOS for some years now, but it's a very similar idea. So this is more efficient because it's using native support for virtual machines. But either way, you're still running a virtual machine. So if you've installed Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, it will show up as an app on your operating system. It should automatically start when you boot your computer, but if not, then you'll need to run the app Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac. I think the confusing thing about Docker for Windows, at least, I'm not sure about Mac, but it actually runs in the background and it doesn't have any obvious windows or icons. It will in fact show up as an icon in your tool tray here, and it's this icon here. And we can see it's just saying Docker is starting. There is a right-click menu available where you can quit Docker, and there's a link to the documentation and so on there. But, just as I've been talking there, actually I do have a window saying Docker is now up and running. So I am recording here on Windows 10 Professional, so I'm able to use Docker for Windows. So if you're using Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, once you've installed it and it's running, then you can use Docker really from any of your terminal windows. Here I have a regular Cygwin installation, and if I type Docker there, I'm seeing the Docker commands. I have to tell you though that there are a few problems with running Docker in Cygwin, and I've never really worked my way through those problems. And that's because Docker recommend that you use the Windows PowerShell. So obviously this is only relevant to Windows. If you're on a Mac, then just use the regular terminal prompt. The PowerShell ships with Windows, and you can get at it through the Start menu and just type in power. And this is effectively a much improved version of the command prompt, and you'll be able to issue your Docker commands from there. Finally, if you're not able to run Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, then you'll be running the Docker toolbox. And the big difference is you won't be able to access Docker from your regular terminal or command prompts. Instead, you're going to have to manually run the Docker Quick Start terminal. Now, I do have it installed on this computer just for demonstration purposes, but I can't run it because it will crash my operating system. You absolutely should not have the toolbox and Docker for Windows installed at the same time. I just have it here for illustration. And it's exactly the same on a Macintosh. When you install the Docker toolbox, you'll be given an icon to run the Docker Quick Start terminal. And that terminal will be a terminal very much like the PowerShell that should recognize Docker commands. Now, I know all of that was painful. I hated describing it and explaining it, but there's a lot of misconceptions about what's happening when you're installing Docker on Windows and Mac. You are running virtual machines. The end result of all of this should be in whichever kind of, whether you're in the quick start terminal or if you're in the PowerShell or whatever, you should be able to type docker container run hello-world, and you should see output similar to mine. You will have had an unable to find image locally, it will have done some operations, and then you should be seeing a hello from Docker. If you've got this far, seriously, well done. It's a real pain getting started with Docker on Windows and Mac, but if you're here, then we're ready to start to reap the benefits of Docker, which we'll be doing in the next chapter.